So, welcome to This Cycling Life. Today we have a very special guest, former professional cyclist Svein Tuft. And what Svein and I are going to be talking about today is the topic of transitions. Transitions in life, transitions from being a pro athlete into, I guess, a wider, or next phase of life, and the opportunities and also fears and challenges that sometimes come with that. So, Svein, welcome and great to see you.
Thank you, man. Thanks for having me.
So, Sven, can you maybe give us a little bit of an update where you are right now? Because clearly you're in that phase of sort of post-professional career. So how have you been spending the past months?
Well, my professional career had us living in Andorra, and we loved it there. And it's a special part of Europe, and where we lived was up in the mountains, and it was kind of a bit of a paradise, and it was great for that cycling part of my life. And at that time, last winter, I got into a project where I was going to start running some gravel tours and taking people up in the mountains and showing this part of the world that I love. And when I essentially had everything ready to roll, then that was right around February, March, and the border got shut down, and it was crazy because I was just jumping from professional cycling into something else, and had the throttle on full gas, and I was never really dealing with that whole transition, as you say. Like, I never mentally gave myself that time, and so when I look back now, yeah, you could be like, oh, the pandemic, and oh, that was horrible, that couldn't, basically this project had to be put on hold, and you lose out on that plan. But in the end, it was such a good time to put on the brakes and actually deal with a lot of this stuff that we're talking about. Because I think in life you can just keep those blinders on, and that's part of that cycling world as well. Is that I think it's one of the things that I kind of got addicted to. You could just ignore the outside world and focus so intensely on this thing that you love. So yeah, to make that long story short, we in that time with my family, I realized how, with a young son, how important that time is to be part of his life, and to just keep pushing forward and running away from that is not, it's not the best way to go. And I've been doing that for 20 some odd years, right? So it's time to reassess that. And through all that time being locked down in Europe there, we came up with a plan to make our way back to Canada. So yeah, here I am back in British Columbia, really close to where I grew up. So yeah, we've just got through quarantine, and yeah, life is, we're kind of starting phase 2 of life.
Yeah, fantastic. And Sven, it's always an interesting thing for a professional athlete to, in a way, get to a point in their career where they're in many ways at their peak, maybe not physically, but in terms of experience and the accrued knowledge and all that sort of stuff. You're kind of looked at in a way as someone who knows a lot, and then to walk away from that sometimes into a career path or a life stage where maybe that kind of knowledge or expertise is not as useful or as appreciated. I mean, what's your experience been there?
Well, like, that's exactly right. It's a really strange job in the fact that as you go through the years, as you gain that experience, as you've done every race, as you know how all of these things go, and you have this experience to pass on to the young guys, all of a sudden people are asking you, like, so when are you going to retire, and these kinds of things, when in most businesses you would be moving into higher ranks and higher positions, and having more say in that company. And really in cycling, it's just see you later. And I think that's really unfortunate. And I think for a lot of guys, it can be really detrimental, because quite often the life is so, like I was speaking to before, you have these blinders on. And one of the hard parts about cycling is that when you're getting close to the time that you are thinking about retiring, you still can't think about it. Now, I'm not going to say everyone's like that, but I know for myself, it was a very all-consuming thing. And in order for me to be at my best, I couldn't allow those other thoughts to sneak in, like, what am I going to do after? What, like starting something else, because I needed most of my energy to just focus, and I wanted to just focus on being my best at that job for as long as I could because I loved it. But it's kind of scary because you don't want to accept that there's going to be that change. You
Mm.
don't really plan for it. Like when people say, "Oh, are you planning for this and that?" I think for most guys that's really hard
Yeah.
because that job is so full on that as soon as you start to think like that, you've got your foot out the door. And
Yeah.
all of a sudden you're up north, it's pissing rain, it's 4 degrees, and you've got your some plan on whatever business you're going, and you're like, you start to go, why the hell am I doing this? And that could be in the spring of a year where you have another contract.
Yeah.
You owe it to the team. You sign that contract and you have to give your best to the team. So I was always a little leery of that, but it really doesn't help you on the backside. And like I said,
But do you think, Sven, do you think that's also, because the interesting thing for me is I've had, I've mentored former pro cyclists and I have relationships and ongoing friendships with many former pro riders. But I also kind of get a sense that that's almost like a myth within the sport. And I'm not going to say like a myth in that it's not significant, but quite a few former pros have said to me, actually, during my career, I was told not to think too hard or distract yourself with other interests because that would, like you're saying, it would detrimentally affect your performance today. And of course, the team wants you more on thinking about today and delivering them results and thinking about your future. But then on the other hand, I've met people or talked to others, I think people like Michael Rogers, I mean, Adam Hansen is a good example, who actually have been able to do both, be professional athletes, but also invest energy and time in either educating themselves or thinking about that transition. And it hasn't really seemed to impact their sort of what I would say active careers. So is it a myth? Is it just a myth actually that it's too easy to say, look, I shouldn't focus on it, I should just push it to later, because actually looking at it is hard. Learning new things isn't easy.
yeah,
What's your response to that?
I think I think you're probably spot on. The myth, or maybe just that belief that like I think it's a dangerous belief, and I'm not saying like for me that was the truth. I say like those guys like Adam Hansen and Nick Rogers, they're kind of anomalies, right? Because there's some guys that are just so switched on, they're gonna have things sorted out all the time, and I always say hats off to that. That's never been my way. I'm not like much of a details man. So for me, it was the way the you have to understand like my history before the sport was I never had a plan. Like
Mm-hmm.
for me,
Right.
uh, back in the day, if I go back, 25 years ago, I was riding around on a bike with a trailer, and I had nothing to my name, and I was seriously content with that. So it's going to be different for every person. Some people want a lot out of life, and they they always have like these projects going, and I think that's awesome. But for me, I've always liked a different way of life. So for me, being an introvert first of all, and being involved and immersed in that world, it was already a lot of energy for me. And I'm not trying to like uh, make an excuse or anything like that. But for me, that was just how I had to function. When I was in, I was all in to that thing, and side projects were just taking more and more energy, and I had to like build up all my energy to be on the road to be my best for the team, because I at that time I really did care a lot about that.
Yeah.
But I think you're exactly right. Like it's kind of an easy way out, and I will say that's a detrimental thing that cyclists do. We surround ourselves by people who kind of praise what we're doing, and there's no growth in that, right? Because when
Yeah.
people only tell you you're doing awesome, and they're just like you for being a cyclist, which is the worst thing,
Mm.
um, you don't grow and you don't push yourself. So a lot of times too, it's like your environment, and I
Mm.
think that there's a big hole in the whole cycling world, because teams, like you said, they're not pushing for that. They don't want you thinking about other things or planning businesses on the side and this and that, when quite often, like you said, the most motivated people I've known are the ones doing that, and they're great riders as well, right?
I wonder too, Sven, and this is I'm sure you've had some time, as you said, to reflect on this. But again, I think one of the things that and not just cyclists, of course, that many pro athletes focus on so much is developing their skill sets. You know, when we say the skills, you know, the skills of training, the skills of learning about the nutrition, the equipment, you know, all the training protocols, all that kind of stuff. So they become very skilled at that. And I guess as a team, in terms of the leadership and management, they admire you for your skills, you know, on the bike or in terms of your training, whatever it is. However, one of the things that I've seen is that a lot of former pro riders I've met is they confuse the difference between skills and talents, you know, because actually if you think about someone like and I haven't met him personally, but I certainly have seen him in action and seen the way he interacts with people, someone like a Matthew Heyman, right, who to me looks as though someone who's not just very skillful in understanding the tactics of a race, he also has a talent of, you know, orchestrating an environment or a culture or relationships with people, right? So what's your take on that? I mean, do riders, I guess, understand enough this difference and the importance? Because post-cycling career life, it's more the talents which become important as opposed to the skills. You know, the talents that you have as a person in terms of fostering collaboration or inspiring people or communicating with people. What's your take on that?
You're exactly right. Again, I mean, this is a real case dependent thing when you talk about Matty Heyman.
Mm,
I mean, that's his character, and he's been involved at a very high level for so many years. And yeah, one of the best things, you know, for our team when Matty came is like he brought years of experience, and his talent is in like he's got that leadership role, you know. And I talk to the boys now, and they just say he's just an incredible. Like when they go up to the classics, it's
yeah.
just dialed. And
Mm,
obviously, you couldn't have a better guy running that classics program. But you're exactly right. Matty would find his way in any role, you know, whether it was in the corporate world or whatever, in that leadership role, because it's one of the ways he's learned over time. He started at the very bottom, you know, coming over as a young guy into Europe, and finding his way when it was very difficult to make it. And those guys who made it then really, really made it, you know. It
yeah.
was like they were in. And then you look at his career, and he just built and built and built on that, and became like you know, a confident leader. And I agree completely. Like that's his skill, that's his talent.
Mm,
And that's something that you can't teach anyone, right? Like those are hard learned lessons. And yeah, I think that's the real gold that comes out of that world, because in many ways you lose a lot of other things in sport, because you're bypassing so much of
yeah.
life, where other people are gaining these these skills in the business world. We are kind of devolving in that way, but we're picking
And
up so many other things.
I mean, if I was to ask somebody that knows Svein Tuft, and if I were to say to, I don't know, Matt Heyman, if I was to ask somebody, you know, what are Svein's talents, what would they tell me?
It's a good question. I don't know, but um, I think for me it's a similar way of Matty Heyman, in just the sense that I think a lot about how organizations run, and I'm always trying to figure out how to make them better. Because what I've seen is, you know, when you're part of groups for 20 plus years, the number one thing for me is how do they function together.
Mm,
And when I start to see, you know, you see patterns over time, and whether it's through the administration, whether it's the I mean, for me, it always comes from the top up. The culture created by the very top has this trickle down effect to everyone. Like the soigneurs, the mechanics, everything is affected by the culture that those guys created within the team, the administration. And I always use Green Edge as a great example for that. Is they created this culture that they didn't have to do any babysitting. The
Mhm.
guys did all that work because the guys saw how important it was to keep that. That's how we won races. When you had guys selling out 100% for each other, truly selling out, then we were successful. And so for me, I learned that very early on. And I've never been a big outspoken guy saying like, oh, this is how we do things. But I like to speak to the people who have the control of those things and bring my ideas. And I'm always thinking about that, but I'm more quiet and more reserved when it comes. If people want to talk to me about that, I'm more than happy to. But I think probably my the thing that I learned the most over cycling is trying to understand how to make an organization operate at its best with the people, because I think the people are everything.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, but
yeah,
it's interesting you say that, because a recurring thing that's also come up in conversations with me mentoring people who've come out of a pro career has been, they've sometimes said, I made a wrong choice. You know, for example, my agent recommended me to go to this team because of the money and the opportunities. And then I found myself in an environment in which I couldn't thrive. Right.
yep.
So what would be the advice you would give to someone? I mean, and this is not just for cycling, by the way, because also, you know, I talk to a lot of, you know, young people who are, you know, maybe in their mid-20s, early 30s, who are making career choices. And I often see the same thing. You know, they're following the choice based on the money or the status of the position. And then they find themselves in an environment in which they can't thrive, actually. I mean, what would your advice be to people about that? You know, this balance between, you know, because I guess your career to an extent as a pro athlete does have an expiry date, but to what extent should you be balancing that sort of pursuit of money and status versus culture, friendship, the group that you're in? How do you look at that?
It's a great point.
Mm,
I think what you have to it gets very tricky because at the world tour it's very difficult, you know, like the pressure is high. But you have to I can only use myself as an example because I know the decisions I made, and it was based more on the fact that I loved to do so much what I was doing that money was never going to be the number one issue for me. And exactly what you said, I've seen guys many times make that decision with poorly advised by an agent who's just pushing for his piece of the pie,
mhm,
and they put themselves in this high pressure situation that is not sustainable.
mm,
And what happens is they end up blaming it on the team and the environment of the team, but in their they were being pushed so much to live up to this thing that they created that wasn't true about themselves, this level of ability that was not possible.
mm.
And that pressure was cracking them through that year or whatever 2 years that they signed for this contract, and it kind of ruins them. So they made a choice based on money. And unless you're like a Sagan type of a character who's just gonna like day in day out back up big results and all that stuff, you have to understand like where you stand in the sport. It's about awareness more than anything. It's like understanding who you are and what you actually can do day in and day out. And for me, I was always very happy with, I knew what I could do within a season. I wanted to be consistent, and I wanted to always be the kind of rider that could add to the race in some way, whatever race it was. So for me, that was number one. And I think that's the most important thing, is to not go chasing after the money, is to first of all do that thing because you love it. If it's supporting you, great. And then from there you can assess like what do you provide that team, but it shouldn't be the number one thing, just pushing and pushing for more money, because teams, they're going to hold you accountable all the time. And so there's that constant pressure that if you can't live up to that, you're gone. And then you'll see that guys go from one team to the next next, and each time it's just down, down, down a notch. And then all of a sudden, 5 years later, whatever, they're done at the age of
Yeah.
30, 32. And quite often those years were so stressful, so intense, that they're kind of a ghost of who they were. They're kind of a broken person at, like, by the time they come out of that, because it's the burn rate is high, and it's not a fun place to be, I don't think.
Yeah.
And I've seen guys do that all too much, make the trade for money, and in the end, I think it's like anything you do in business as well. It's like, if you don't love that thing, I don't care what they pay you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I guess that's also, I mean, you've talked a lot about how much you love the sport, and I've heard you talk about that so many times. So in a way you had a real driver. I mean, your why was your love for and passion for what you were doing. But again, I wonder if we look at a lot of, if we look, and again, we look at the world of business or we look at organizations today, one of the common things that I hear, especially with millennials, is to say, look, I don't want to work for an organization that does bad shit. I don't want to work for an organization that's not sustainable or is polluting or whatever it might be. And yet when I walk into cycling teams, and even when I meet the senior management of cycling teams, I very rarely hear these people talking about a higher purpose of doing what they're doing. Whether it's, I mean, okay, Doug Ryder is a really exception to that. Clearly, what he's tried to achieve working together with the Quebec Foundation and cycling in Africa, but that really is an exception. So I wonder, is there a role, or should there be a role for cycling teams to have any kind of a purpose or a mission beyond winning bike races, or promoting an IT services company or something? What's your take on that? And does it matter for the riders? Because one of the things I've certainly seen in Doug Ryder's example, if you meet people who have ridden, whether it was for NTT or Dimension Data, the riders themselves do tend to take on that purpose as well. Whereas I did hear another interview with a guy who was working for another team who was owned by a now deceased Swiss gentleman, who said, it doesn't really float my boat to win races to sell more bikes.
Yeah.
So what's your take?
So, yeah, it's a great point. I think, unfortunately, the template of cycling has been what it has been for many years now, and that's always been the way. It's kind of like this: dupe some guy into paying you, whatever, 10, 20 million for the next couple of years, hope that he's still keen when it comes to re-sign again, and just try and keep your organization, because each team is basically been the same, for many years. Like, I think of, Lamprey going on to, it's the same organization. UAE, it's the same guys. Movie Star has been however many teams, before that, and they're just trying to get the money to keep the machine turning over. And that's the problem I've always found with cycling, is it's like everyone's in this survival mode. So to do what you're talking about, what Doug Ryder has done, and I couldn't agree more, is like, you talk to the people who's been involved in that organization, and there's a whole other level for the riders to go like, wow, because most of the time we're in that bubble, we're not exposed to anything new, growing, or like you said, a reason or a cause that kind of adds to our life. We're just stuck, like I said, blinders on. And so again, I think I couldn't agree with you more. There's a huge hole in the game there. But when you're running on survival, you don't grow. And I know that's been the same for myself. When I've been in survival mode, I'm not learning. I'm not like engaged in conversation and trying to grow myself as a person. I'm just trying to make it from day to day. And that's how I believe cycling is right now, and has been for a very long time. And there's subtle changes, but as with most things, until the old guard, until the old way of doing things, move on from running at the very top, because again, it comes to that thing, that culture that you create, it doesn't change. It's just like science, right? Until the guys who are clinging on to their beliefs pass away, science doesn't really change a lot, in that, until that generation who
Yeah.
kind of control everything, right? Until they're done, and the new people can bring in their new ideas and research. Then,
Yeah.
yeah.
Interesting. And Sven, I mean, you're still a young guy, right? I mean, you're 43 years old, so you've got at least another, I don't know, 20, 25 years potentially of productive kind of work ahead of you. I mean, do you have any fears or like any, yeah, I don't know. What are your biggest uncertainties or fears about that future right now?
Well, look, what when I came to the world of cycling, I never had a plan. It was never like I have to be a cyclist. And prior to that, I worked every kind of job you can imagine. I didn't start racing until the age of 23, 24. So um, I lived a whole other many lives before this cycling world. And one of my beliefs was always like, if you're a hard worker and you have like you care about the process and how things get done properly. I find I've up to that point I never had a problem finding work. So to this day I have that still. It's still a part of me, but like you said, it's when you have a family and you have a certain way of living, it is kind of scary, you because now it's not just me. In those days, it was just me, and if I slept out in the field somewhere in a tent, and that's what I was going to do for a couple months, then that was great. But when you have kids and family to take care of, that's not so cool. So yeah, you have these things that kind of worry, and especially these days with like all the uncertainty, it can add to that. But in in my experience, I can only go based on experience and not by. I don't really run a lot of what people tell you or what the world is creating as news and all these fear-based things, because I think that's not a way to live life. So yeah, for me, I have a lot of projects coming,
Yeah.
um, but how they're all going to pan out, I don't know. But I'm excited for that phase of life,
Mm.
and I'm willing to take those risks. And I think in life it's just like bike racing.
Mhm.
You get better, like the only way you get in the mix to the point of actually the pointy end of the race is by taking risks.
Yeah.
And so that same rule applies in life. And so yeah, I'm looking forward to see how that pans out, because it's like we discussed before, it's a whole other world
Yeah.
jumping into, and it's
Terrific.
like I'm a baby again when it comes to business. And I learned a lot in back in Andorra trying to start everything before the lockdown, and so I feel like I'm already a step further along in that process. So yeah, it's all part of that. Yeah, that
Right.
process.
Mhm. No, it's great to hear, Sven. I mean, I went through a pretty big life transition myself about 10 years ago. I'd had a 20-year career, full on, international travel and,
Yeah,
yeah, pretty stressy kind of situation. And actually, at that time, because you have a 3-year-old and you have one child on the way. And I think that was also a thing that I had to reflect on personally, which is, you know, when you're at this age, which is your early 40s, which is where you are now and where I was kind of 10 years ago, I think it's also that question of how you think about success, right? Because in that period of your 20s and 30s, your success was defined as winning bike races or national TT championships, which you have a whole bunch of in Canada. Um, but then, of course, you wake up one morning and it's not just about you anymore. It's also about your partner and your kids, and that also, I think, causes us to reflect a lot about what success really means. So I was really happy to hear when we spoke earlier that one of the things you said was that you really want to spend time with your children and be a dad to them. How are you doing with that? I mean, how do you feel about sort of being a home dad partly as well?
well, I think that's one of the things that again happened in that lockdown time, where the number one thing I understood about parenting was that you can have all the best schools and fanciest house and sweet cars and just create like what society tells us is this great model for raising a child in, like with all these things. And in the end, it's just time. they just want your time. So if you can't give that time, all this stuff in the world doesn't matter to them. So I saw that very clearly, and it's something I always knew. But again, when I was still racing, it was harder to do because you're focused on, and then you're traveling, and then you're when you're home, you're home. It was good, but then you're just away too much, and
Yeah.
so that was something I really saw, was that it was just time,
Mhm.
and they want your time. They don't care if you live in a crappy old motel, you know.
Right.
If you're taking them out on walks and hanging out with them, that's it. That's
Yeah.
all they care about. And I saw that really clearly, and I said, you know, going forward, I don't want to create a life where I'm running around like a maniac trying to, in the idea of making my family's life better, which up to an extent, yeah, we have to have things. We have to have, you know, a roof over our heads and have good food, and those things are important. But anything beyond that, you have to start questioning what it is you're actually chasing after. And I found for myself, it's just going back to what you said. When you That's what being young, that's what 20, 30, that's this is my opinion, this is what I learned, is that for me it was about pushing it to see where I could go, and it was just me. And you hit a point in life where that's not the driver anymore. That's not interesting. And like that's the funny thing, is like even racing or the idea of competition now, and it's probably just because I've been doing it for so long, and maybe it'll drift back my way, but
Mhm.
even that doesn't interest me, because it's just, I know the mentality I get to chase after that, and it's going back. So maybe I need a little break from that, you know, to
Yeah.
just reassess how I'm going to do that in the future, because it is a part of me. I love
Mm.
that aspect, but for now it's just, I have to make big changes, and I have to grow as a person. And a big part of that was, and I'm still working at it, is just being present as much
Yeah.
as I can in the way that I know, because, you know, I'm probably wasn't too great to start with. So
Yeah,
like a lot of things
I
in life.
mean, I speak from my own experience. You know, it took me time to learn how to be a dad, actually. You know, and be really present, as you said, because I think there's a difference to being physically present with your kids and being, you know, completely there and with them and listening and all that stuff. But how about for your partner? Because, you know, one of the things, you know, when I had my full on career and I was traveling all the time and, you know, away a lot and working long hours, I mean, it didn't make my wife happy. But then on the other hand, when I started working for myself, when I started being at home a lot, that also freaked her out a little bit, because I was like, you know, like I didn't know how to use the washing machine, and I did everything wrong when it came to the doing stuff for the kids and everything. So I felt really a bit out of my, I don't know, a bit out of my comfort zone, actually, just becoming a proper parent again. I mean, how have you dealt with that in your relationship? You being home so much more now?
Well, I think, yeah, I hear what you're saying, but it's mostly been positive. You
Mm,
know, like it's. I would say it's, you know, sure, there's a few things here and there, and like you said, being home all the time. But I feel like it's only added to our experience together. Like it's only made our lives better. I can't say there's been a lot of negatives. So yeah, I have to say I feel pretty lucky. I think she's super happy to have me around and share that load, because for, you know, for moms, the little ones need them the most, and it can be taxing, you know, like they're just constantly energy sucking them, you know. And yeah, you can just take them for a hike in the mountains and give mom that break, then that's a lot. That's worth it- all the annoyances I can cause probably get taken away in that 2 hour break, you know.
sure. That's great. Sven, I know you've got other things to do today, so I'd just like to say a huge thanks for joining us, and I mean also just for being so open and honest with your answers, which of course I completely expected, having seen you and watched you so many times in interviews and interactions before. But it's really been a pleasure having you here. I certainly wish you every success for the future, and be delighted, you know, always to have an open ear to catch up anytime you'd like to talk about what the future brings, or the direction you're going to take. Just to close, Sven, any last pieces of advice you would like to give people who are going through a life transition?
Well, I think, yeah, that's could be a big one, but I'll try and condense it down pretty to the bare bones of what I think I learned through it all is make sure you deal with who you are first before you go chasing after that next thing that's probably going to be exactly what you knew before. And I think we have to deal with a lot of baggage from our previous life, our previous thing that we were doing. Really take some time. It's not going to be dealt with in a couple weeks. If you're fortunate enough to take that time, take some months, take a year, put put a break on it, and kind of deal with who you are. Because I know, like in professional cycling and anything where you're pushing it to the very top level, it's all consuming, and there's a lot of weird habits and weird ways of thinking that come with that. And yeah, give yourself a break. That's it. Like, if that's number one, I know for me that changed everything.
Yeah. Yeah, I hear. That's great. Svein Tuft, thank you very much for your time. Of course, for all of those of you who've been watching this interview, if you have liked what you've seen, please do give us the thumbs up. And of course, please do subscribe to the YouTube channel. Svein Tuft, thank you again for your time. It's been great. Thank you.
Thank you.